And I am the chair of the Upper Mississippi River Region ILO. So we have 56 local leagues and 4 state leagues that have joined together along the Mississippi River and the contributing river watersheds to work on Mississippi River issues. We're new, we don't have a website yet. The Lake Michigan ILO does have a website, and so you can follow them, and they're linking to us, and as we get resources up, we just became official in April and we're still trying to get our feet under us. So that's kind of who we are. Yesterday we had a wonderful table discussion out there. I put a little water sign up and people were attracted, and it turns out that people in California, Nevada, the thirsty West are thinking about forming an ILO too. And that Hawaii has lots of water issues as climate change makes the ocean levels rise and there's less and less of Hawaii. And so these are things that affect us everywhere. And so our speaker today is Lynn Scarlett. Lynn is the Global Managing Director for Public Policy at the Nature Conservancy, and she's also the Global Climate Strategy Lead. And in a previous life, she was Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Department of Interior, so she's a big wig. We're very, very pleased to have her here. She's going to talk a bit, and then we'll all talk. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning. We're all bright and early, so we're ready to go. I am absolutely delighted to be here, and what a terrific thing to see so many folks deeply engaged in striving to make democracy work in America. So thank you very much for those efforts. I want to start with a little bit of context about the Nature Conservancy. We are the largest conservation organization in the world. We operate in 69 countries and all 50 United States. We've been around for about 64, 65 years, and in that time period, we have conserved about 120 million acres of land. We started with a land focus and land protection, but we've broadened out and now work on oceans and marine issues. We work on water issues around the globe, on climate, which is a big and central challenge for us, and now finally in the last couple of years actually working in cities. Our focus is on conservation that benefits people and nature. So early on in our years, we protected places that had significant natural resources and biodiversity. We have increasingly come to realize in our work in Africa, in Latin America, and elsewhere that we've got to do conservation that works for the economic well-being of people as well as protects nature. So, big challenge in that endeavor. We have a world moving towards 9 billion people, and when you zero in and just think about the challenges that presents with respect to water, they are many. We face challenges of water for drinking, challenges of water for food, and of course then there's risk reduction. One of my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy often says our water challenges fall into 3 categories. We either have too much, too little, or it's too dirty. And so put all that together, it means water challenges are many. And of course there's much conflict. During my 8 years at the U.S. Department of the Interior, you could throw a dart on the map, as was just indicated, and see water challenges just about anywhere. We're long familiar with challenges in the West, but in fact, while I was at Interior, we faced challenges in the Southeast between Georgia, Florida, Alabama, debating over insufficient water needs to run hydropower, to provide water for agriculture, to provide municipal water, etc., in what was a big tug of war. This is the notorious or much in the headlines Klamath Basin. When I arrived at the Interior Department in 2001, it was much in the news because of operating of the reservoirs and dams and irrigation water, and the holding back of some water in order to secure water for species, but of course that meant less water for farmers. It resulted in a major tug of war and ultimately a lot of collaboration to try and bring all that together and come to a peaceful resolution that worked for everyone. But you could look at the Klamath, you could look at the Southeast, as I mentioned, you could go across the United States and indeed the globe and see water conflicts. There are many water stressors. And here we look at India and recognize that much of the world still lacks basic water infrastructure. By our science analysis, and we do have about 500 scientists at the Nature Conservancy, we find that over 2 billion people have lack of access to basic sanitation. And that means poor health, it means water bodies are utilized, waste goes into those bodies, there are health adversities associated with that, etc. And of course, in the United States and much of the developed world, we do have infrastructure, but it is aging. One looks at Flint, Michigan, one looks at the challenges there of lead in pipes, but that is a challenge replicated across much of this nation. Indeed, it is estimated that there are hundreds of billions of dollars of backlog in need for upgraded infrastructure. Major challenge as we seek to ensure clean drinking water, well-treated wastewater, and of course then water for species and water for the rest of nature. The challenge, of course, is that climate change brings more complications to an already challenging picture. Let me just run through a few of the effects of a changing climate on water. First, of course, with increased frequency of high-intensity storms, we see coastal erosion and flooding. Let us fly for a moment up to Alaska. While I was at Interior, one community there had gone from a very stable coastal situation for thousands of years to one in which they were losing as much as 160 feet of coastline in a single year. Why? Because sea ice was melting, permafrost was thawing. When you have permafrost, it's like concrete, and when you have sea ice, it's like a buffer against coastal storm waves. When that goes away, those waves hit that thawing permafrost, the coast erodes. That entire community is facing possible relocation. They are not alone in the world as we see climate change unfolding. But then, of course, we have sea level rise, and with it, saltwater intrusion, a major problem in places like Florida. By the way, these effects are not in some hypothetical future. They are happening now. So many counties in Florida, by the way, Republican and Democrat, are working hard to figure out what to do about this. Because the very security, the very water upon which those communities rely is affected. And then, of course, we see changes in precipitation patterns, and that includes the timing of rainfall. So you see these huge deluges, 16 inches all at one time in 24 hours, for example. You see changes in the form of precipitation. So in the Rocky Mountain West, precipitation coming as as rain and not snow. And you might think, why does that matter? Well, snow is actually the storage of water for the West. It is that snow that when it stays snow and melts late into the summer, actually provides a continued water source in the West. When it all melts instead, early in the spring, or when it comes down as rain, you don't have that storage. So changes in precipitation patterns, changes in the timing of timing of rain, changes in the form. And then, of course, we have these high intensity storms with this water that comes all at once, and it is increasing stresses on stormwater and stormwater management. I could list some other effects, but these are the primary ones. Now, what to do about all that? First, let us look at the big picture, the big tableau, and there are 4 features that make solutions challenging. First is there's unbelievable interconnected complexity. Go back to that example of snow. The snow, and when it melts, connects to storage challenges, connects to water flows, and all of that then affects the opportunities for irrigation. When I was at Interior, the Bureau of Reclamation used to determine each year how much water for irrigation it would allocate to farmers. And it would use historic data to figure out just exactly how much water they could expect, and therefore tell the farmers how much water they would get. Well, it turns out that those historic data were no longer very useful with these changing water patterns. And so using them, they would tell the farmers, you get 25% of your annual allocation, and whoops, what would turn out is all of a sudden in July they would have to say, sorry, you're going to get 5% of your allocation. Not good for the farmer. And so interconnected complexities also change. Now, of course, as Heraclitus said, and I know you all think about him often, all is flux, nothing stays still. Now, he was a Greek philosopher back thousands of years, so change has always been with us, but what we are seeing now is dramatic change, rapid change, change that stretches our ability to plan and think for the future. Of course, with interconnected complexity, with change also comes uncertainty, and then there's the challenge that these problems unfold at multiple scales. Let us go back to the Great Lakes. You have individual communities with their challenges. That links to an individual lake, which links to multiple lakes, which links to the entire Mississippi River Basin. And so multiple scales of action present challenges of where we put our solutions. So, you all remember Alice in Wonderland. She comes to that fork in the road. She sees the Cheshire Cat, looks up and says, tell me please, which way ought I to go from here? The cat looks down and helpfully says, it depends on where you want to get to. So let us posit that where we want to get is a situation where we're sustaining economic vitality, community well-being, and environmental integrity. So I'm going to focus today on nature's benefits. Now, there are many solutions to our water problems, some of them of which involve investment in upgrading that infrastructure I talked about. But I'm going to focus on nature and what nature can bring to the solution set. Nature can reduce risks and enhance resilience along coasts and along riverways affected by flooding. Think about this. Sea marshes, oyster reefs, coral reefs actually abate or minimize storm surge. Think about our Gulf of Mexico. Our Gulf of Mexico, we have lost 100 miles of sea marsh over the past 100 years. Now, the U.S. Geological Survey says that for about each 2.7 miles of sea marsh, you reduce storm surge by about a foot. So do the math. A Category 5 storm 100 years ago, 30-foot storm surge, reaches New Orleans at 1 foot. Today, no sea marsh, it reaches New Orleans at 30 feet. So restoring nature, helping to rebuild those sea marshes, restore oyster reefs, can help minimize or attenuate storm surge and help to protect communities. There are other things, by the way, that nature does. Those mangroves actually store carbon. They're sort of the lungs of the earth, along with other forests and vegetation. And so they actually help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So just a little bit of data here. About 16% of the U.S. nearshore coastline does right now, not tomorrow, face high hazards from high-intensity storms. So nature can bring resilience. So the Nature Conservancy is actually working with communities particularly along the Atlantic shore, but also in the Gulf, to rebuild oyster reefs. And by the way, in the rebuilding of the oyster reefs, not only do you get attenuation of storm waves, but you also get habitat for fish and other critters. It benefits the fisheries industry because their efforts then have more resources to draw from. So you get benefits to communities in terms of better safety and better economics in terms of enhanced fisheries. But you know, it's not all about nature. And so don't worry about looking at the devilish details on this chart. But what we are looking at is recognizing there is some gray infrastructure. That means concrete and engineered stuff. But there is a way to use that existing system and build nature in to make the whole bigger than the sum of the parts. So work along the Texas Gulf Coast, where there is a seawall, but add in or enhance protecting the mudflats and sea marshes, and use the two to work together. Now, the challenge, of course, of much of this kind of effort, thinking about that coastline, is governance needs. You need large landscape coordination. It doesn't help. Think of the Northeast. How many of you are from the Northeast? So think of Hurricane Sandy. How many of you experienced that in some way? A few of you. You know, it doesn't help if just one community tries to restore its sand dunes or its coastal marshes and so forth, if the one next door and the one up here and the one over there does not. It needs to work as a system. So you need large-scale coordination. This is all about public and private engagement. You need the private sector, you need the public sector, and of course you got to get the incentives right. I'll explain that in a moment. But let me talk about landscape scale coordination and another kind of solution that we're working on at the Nature Conservancy. It turns out that many watersheds, meaning the forested or other areas that have streams and rivers flowing through them that ultimately end up often in cities, are very degraded. Degraded either because of poor forestry practices, let's say in Latin America, or agricultural practices that result in some runoff and so forth. And so helping to clean the water in cities often means looking beyond the city and looking to that watershed. And so what we've been doing, starting in Latin America, first starting in Quito in Ecuador, is to actually work with the government and with cities and with companies to invest in protecting that watershed. Invest in restoring the forest land, working with farmers on practices that reduce the runoff from their practices, and all of that can be done to help secure the water for Quito, enhance it, help to keep it clean, and by the way, it turns out it's cheaper to do some of that stuff than it is to build mechanical treatment facilities. Let's take New York. Anyone from New York? So New York really pioneered this. New York long benefited from the watershed, the Catskill Mountains, and all those streams that came down there. But what was happening is as that area started to get built out, they'd get runoff from stormwater with junk in it. As agricultural practices expanded, they would get some runoff from those practices. So the water was starting to get dirty in New York. And they had a challenge. Either spend billions of dollars on a mechanical filtration system or invest in nature. And so what they did was to work with farmers, work upstream, work with communities, and invest in nature. That is a kind of water fund. We now have 30 of these around the world we're working on, and about 60 more that are on the horizon. In the US Forest Service has begun to pioneer this concept as well. In 2004, while I was at Interior, there was a huge fire that broke out called the Hayman Fire, burned 400,000 acres. And as a result of that, with all that burned area, you got huge amount of erosion. All that sediment went into the Denver Municipal Water System reservoirs. tens of millions of dollars to clean that up and enable that system to serve the Denver community. And so the community said, hark, we don't want this to happen again. What can we do differently? And so they partnered with the Forest Service and invested with the Forest Service in better forest management, reducing underbrush, reducing the risks of catastrophic wildland fire, so that they'd have healthier forests, less likelihood of those fires, and less likelihood of being exposed to that sedimentation and that disaster should a fire break out. I want to talk about scale in a different way. I just came from Maine, where I was on Tuesday and Wednesday. You know, we in this country have a lot of infrastructure, thousands of dams. Many of them built 150 years ago. They were built for running factories and so forth. The factories are no longer there. Many of these are rather inoperable, in fact, but they still are there. And they block connectivity of the rivers, making it very difficult for fish that used to be there and used to go upriver to travel along the rivers. And so what we have done with many, many, many partners, the Nature Conservancy was not the only one by any stretch of the imagination, working with local tribes, the Penobscot tribe and others, we took a large-scale vision, looked at a bunch of those old dams, worked with the private sector, by the way, the owners of the dams, and said, you know, some of these aren't providing any power for the community, or very little. And we could, by the way, if we look at this whole thing, maybe remove a couple of those dams, enhance the power in some of the other dams, get the same amount of hydropower, but increase the connectivity of the river, improve things for the fish, and by the way, provide a different kind of recreation amenity for people. And so, project completed. I was up in Maine cutting the ribbon for the final stage of this. 2 dams removed, and then for a 3rd dam, they kept the dam in place but created a bypass so the water could go around it. Guess what the results are for the fish? About 5 years ago, 3,000 alewives made their way up that river system. This year, so far, more to come, 1.7 million. A huge change. And the community, very much a part of the solution, the private sector part of the solution, a win-win-win-win for the community, the economy still, and its power needs met, and then good for the fish. So public-private action critical. I talked about scale, but let me talk a little bit more about public-private action. And let us go virtually to the Tualatin Basin in Oregon near Portland. Here, you had a situation where you had 4 wastewater treatment plants and a stormwater system all flowing into the water and increasing the water temperature. So that system was exceeding the Environmental Protection Agency regulations for temperature, really critical to salmon in that system. Now, under the Clean Water Act, the old-fashioned way of coming into compliance with temperature would have been to install refrigeration systems on those outflows. Not so funny, because it is actually done in some places. But the cost would be about $60 million. And by the way, it would be energy using, and so sort of contributing to climate challenges. But the city said, or the city's water district said, we can do this differently. So they went to EPA and said, can we combine those 4 wastewater permits and that stormwater permit into one single bundle? And instead of investing in refrigeration, work with farmers, pay farmers, to replant vegetation along 37 miles of stream, the sort of mixing area for the temperature. And so for a price tag of $6 million, with that vegetation and its shading, bring the water temperatures down, good for the salmon, pay the farmers, so more money in their pockets, and also benefit, of course, other species that enjoy that river habitat. So public-private action, teaming up the Clean Water Act with investment in farms and farmers and working with the local community, getting a good result. You all recognize this. A big watershed. Really big watershed, the Mississippi Basin, it's like half the country. There, you know, again, the challenge is how do we sustain really productive farming, and yet at the same time reduce some of the effects of that on the water system, some of the challenges of what is called hypoxia in the Gulf. All those nutrients come down, they go into the Gulf, they sort of take up all the oxygen and create a sort of a dead zone in the Gulf. How do we do that, and do that in a way that works for farming, works for communities, works for nature, works for river health? And so we're working with farmers again on some best practices to try and minimize the outflow of those nutrients and bring some health back to that system. Now here I get to the point about incentives. What do I mean about incentives? Well, in the old days, which is still partly now, to manage stormwater, many municipalities began to create stormwater districts, and they began to charge stormwater fees. You look at your tax bill or whatever, but they charged those fees on how much you would pay to manage stormwater based on either the square footage of your property or road frontage. Now, the thing about that is it gets some money flowing to manage stormwater, but it doesn't do anything to help people think about how they might manage that landscape differently to reduce the stormwater in the first place. And so a couple of cities, Bellevue, Washington, shown here on the map, said, you know, we can do this differently. Let us charge the fees based on how much permeable surface that property has. So the more permeable surface, the lower your fee. Why? Well, because it turns out the earth is like a great big sponge, and if you leave permeable surface, the water rains come down, they hit that soil, they percolate down through the soil sort of cleanses them, they work their way slowly into the stream water, and you get a better result. Much less stormwater to manage, and cleaner water going into the system. And so they changed their fee structure. We are now working here in Washington, D.C., which is using a similar concept. They have a huge stormwater problem, and they faced billions of dollars of price tag to address that problem. Billions of dollars to retrofit old pipes and tunnels and make them bigger so that they could handle all that flow of stuff. But Washington, D.C., benefiting from some biologists, said we can do this differently. And so while they are building some new infrastructure, at the same time, what they are doing is actually trying to advance permeable pavers, bioswales, that's just a fancy word for, you know, using nature in cities, so that they have more green space, take that water, have it percolate and be treated, and less of it go into the Potomac. So we're working with the city, trying to figure out how to do that, particularly in areas that have a lot of buildings. We're working in particular with some low-income communities. Low-income communities where there are vacant lots. How can we turn those vacant lots into an asset that helps us manage stormwater? So, lots more that we can say about water, lots more we can say about the solutions, but let me close with just a few comments about some of the essential ingredients to success. One, we find absolutely critical the role of collaboration. Solutions need to engage communities, whether we're talking the farming community, whether we're talking cities and low-income communities as we try to look at solutions like permeable surfacing or expanding tree canopy in cities. Collaboration is critical. But there's also some mutual learning here. Sometimes we think that the scientists are the ones that know all the stuff and they tell us what to do. But often it is the communities themselves that have insights on what might be a solution. And so engaging in communities as part of the solution, part of the dialogue up front, not only helps to bring buy-in, but also helps to generate perhaps unthought of solutions. But of course, science is important. A lot of this stuff does involve a lot of technical knowledge, a lot of scientific knowledge. Understanding those oyster reefs and just exactly what they can contribute in terms of coastal resilience is important. One of the things we're doing as we invest in those oyster reefs along the coast is to actually measure the results. How much are they working? What did it cost? What are we getting for what it cost? How can we do better? What can science tell us? So the interface of science and decision making, critical. And on that note, I'm going to close because I think some of the richest dialogue on the challenges of climate and water come from conversation. So thank you very much. So do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we have about 22 minutes. Okay, so
do you want to just say a word or two about what we're up to, because that'll provide some context. Real quickly, then yes, thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. That was great. One thing I want to do that we neglected to do at the start was to thank our co-sponsors of this caucus. So we want to thank the LWV Climate Change Task Force, the League of Tacoma Pierce County, Texas, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York State, Massachusetts, Florida, Lake Erie Basin Committee, and of course the Upper Mississippi River ILO. I think that this broad support for just doing this caucus shows that water problems are occurring across the country. We're all experiencing this in our communities, and it's very relevant. When Lynn was talking, I was feeling pretty good because at the Lake Michigan Region ILO, for the last 2 years, we've had a stormwater program in conjunction with the League of Women Voters of Illinois, where we talked to communities 35 times in the 4 states about stormwater runoff and green infrastructure solutions. And currently we're working on a project, an outreach campaign called Rooting for Clean Water, where we're just trying to educate people that native plants help the ground absorb water and store stormwater. I know Susan from Pennsylvania is here, and she would like to just take 1 minute and talk about a project or an issue in your community. Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, and while that's happening, can I just put up the website?
Yeah.
Okay.
How do you do it?
Yeah, go to the microphone.
Yeah, there's a mic out there.
Yeah,
I'm just going to change the PowerPoint for a second to show on the Lake Michigan League website, which the address we put on the little handouts. Krista has been collecting what leagues are doing across the country. Leagues are doing great stuff on water at the local and state and regional level, and we just wanted to share ideas. And Susan is the president of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania.
Good morning. I have a lot to talk about. You didn't know that. No, I wouldn't dare do that. There's I brought a couple of jars for water for refreshment for you, but we're lost back there. But no, there you go. Thank you. See, and you can tell me which jar you would prefer. I dare you. Thank you. That process of holding up jars of water like that is what helped Pennsylvania have an environmental amendment to the Constitution. And the gentleman who did that for Pennsylvania went to the legislature and said, here, have a drink. We drink this? And that was the beginning and the perfect timing back in the early 70s for that to be accomplished. We're one of the only states that has environmental amendment that's part of our Pennsylvania Constitution. And of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's acknowledged by our legislators, but it's in writing. And it guarantees that we have the right to clean air and clean water, do other clean things. And but unfortunately, as of yesterday, so proud of Pennsylvania. The Senate just passed a bill yesterday that completely discarded all of our oil and gas regulations that were helping to protect our environment. That's really giving it to you in a broad scope, but it happened, and it's, what can we say? We're just speechless. There's been years of work on protection for the environment, and particularly our waterways from this industry. Pennsylvania has a history of coal, steel, oil, gas. They just love our water, and it's not loving them back. So we have an ongoing struggle. We did succeed in helping push back one particular bill that was an egregious environmental assault, where the industry wanted to, they use a lot of water, and they wanted to take the water that was their wastewater, and rather than dumping it back in Lake Erie, they wanted to mix it with acid mine drain water, and then mix it again and use it with fracking process, and then have another chemical mixture. We said, that's not a good idea. So the league was very good at fighting that off, but they're back again, and they'll continue. Waste treatment is the other problem, and we're fighting a toxic waste treatment facility that is going to be within half a mile of the Delaware River that is the source of 5 million people's drinking water. So we have a lot of work to do. We're very distressed about what could happen, and I hope that you will pay attention to your drinking water too.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you.
So that's one story. We have asked leagues from across the country to send us at the Lake Michigan region ILO some of the projects that they've done in their own communities. And we've collected these and we've posted them on our website, which is lwvlmr.org. And it's on the member resources page. And it's really, I was actually kind of like really overwhelmed just to see how much work is going on. Even though this isn't a national priority for the league, it's really a priority in the local leagues. And so I welcome you to check that out, and you can also send us more through the website, and I'd be happy to post it and keep it up. What else was I going to say?
Well, we can take...
Now, yeah, we'd love to take questions now. Thank you for your patience. If you have a question, could you go to the microphone, which is in the middle of the room? Thank you, and thank you for your patience.
First of all, pardon the pun, but it's wonderful to see the room overflowing with us. I also just want to make a comment about the fact that you just mentioned, Krista, that it's not a priority for the National League, which is very distressing, frankly, to many of us, and I'd like to know what we could do about that. But that said, thank you, because there's a lot of information there, and a lot of it is so hopeful. And I'm continually struck by the fact that there are solutions that are cost-effective and work and get everybody working as a community, so thank you for that. The question has to do with what we just heard, and I want to relate that to your talking about collaboration and public-private work. And yet, we are confronted time and time again by lobbyists of the industry. We're dealing with it in Massachusetts big time around natural gas pipelines that are meant for exporting the product, which is infuriating and people don't know it. So can you give us any tips about the work with industry that is deliberately trying to subvert all this stuff? And it makes me angry, so I'm sorry, that's not a very collaborative spirit, but you know, we need help in knowing how to do that.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Couple of comments before I end with some optimism to the question. First of all, of course, it's certainly the case with some of these very, very difficult challenges that there is controversy, there is conflict, there is tension with some in the private sector who would prefer to do things the way they always have done them, and so that challenge doesn't go away, and one needs vigilance of folks like this in the room. And of course, the whole underpinning of the Clean Water Act and the regulations that we have in this country are intended to also provide some mechanism to enforce clean water. So let us just say that's the sort of foundation. and it is critical, and those voices and vigilance remain important. That said, we do find that there are opportunities to work together. So an example would be, I'll give two examples. One is actually with the renewable energy industry and the wind industry, where on the one hand, their impact is not so much on water, but there are potentially adverse impacts on wildlife through migratory bird flight and so forth. And so there have been very collaborative efforts with that industry to look large scale, look at the design of their equipment to reduce those impacts, but then equally important, work to make sure that any facilities like that are sited where they're the least impactful. So we have been very supportive, not only for renewables, but also for natural gas and so forth, very supportive of the vision this administration put forward. They call it the mitigation hierarchy, in the way of Washington, not a real accessible term. But what it means is large-scale spatial planning. Through that planning, identify the least impactful places. For example, if you're in the West, you're trying to site solar or natural gas or whatever it is, do it in a place that's already disturbed. Try to avoid impacts, then minimize, but then require mitigation, that is for the industry that continues to have some impacts regardless of good siting, to have them generate a flow of funds that can be invested in protecting nature, etc. So we've been working with, in the West, and including in with traditional energy suppliers on that large-scale spatial planning. In the Appalachian Mountains, we've done a huge mapping area and working with some in industry to say, you know, as you look at natural gas, as you look at solar, as you look at wind, here's some really sensitive places here, and that includes, by the way, not just species, but water supplies. So don't site there, site over here instead, and then working with them on the design and operation to minimize. So those are examples of collaboration. It doesn't mean that there aren't still some recalcitrant players out there, and in that case, I think one just needs to do exactly what you're doing, sustain the vigilance in the legislature and in other arenas to ensure there's proper enforcement, etc.
So pump up the positive vigilance.
Yes, there we go.
Okay, another question.
It's two things. First, it's a sort of an answer to Massachusetts. I'm Chester County, Pennsylvania, and we have pipelines going through every which way, and they're going to the coast or the Delaware to be exported, just as in your case too. I think some of the same pipelines that are going through us are going through Massachusetts too. You can't collaborate with anybody, but what you need to do is get communities activated, inform them. And unfortunately, this hasn't been through the league, but through a group that has formed to protest this. And so each county in Pennsylvania that is impacted has collaborated with each other and formed a resistance. The problem is that the pipeline industry claims eminent domain. So you sit there and you sit there and you feel helpless and you feel really angry and frustrated. So that's why you want to put that frustration together into energy in getting groups together, getting them to contact their local people who can collaborate in efforts. Get a lawyer who is familiar with the environment and also familiar with the activities, attitudes, etc. of the pipeline people, and just keep fighting. It's really, really tough. But that's
May we ask you to get to your question as well?
Mm-hmm.
Can you get to your question as well, please?
I can, but that was a question that needed to be answered because this is a problem through most of our area. And since we're talking about collaboration, this is part of it.
Oh, I agree. I think that too, when we hear her say that she's taking actions not through league, that's something for us to think about.
Right.
Well, yes,
when we say
because
that,
the league
that water isn't a priority for league, We're addressing things, but not through league. We're engaging, but not through league. Those are all things for us to think about as league.
Yes, exactly.
So your question?
My question. Okay, this is how to. This is what I'm about to ask my question. Chester County, this is a micro question because Chester County has a lot of agriculture. We have big ag and we have little ag. And the little ag suffers because they don't know how to prevent the erosion. And so lots of stuff goes into our waterways, and we have a lot of them because the conservation district doesn't know how to teach them. So how do I get these people together so that it's not confrontational, but that it's all going to work for everybody's benefit? The little farmer thinks that this is loss of his land on which he can farm. So how do we get through that?
Yeah, thank you very much. So the question is, you've got the small farmer, you've got the larger farmers. For the small farmer, engaging them in pollution reduction measures can be very difficult. You know, we face that all over the country, not just in Chester County. We work a lot in the Chesapeake Bay, where there are thousands of small farmers as well as some larger farmers. You know, what we find, first of all, let me say there's no magic. And secondly, also let me say that local voices are critically important. That is, local voices and participants that galvanize that collaboration are critically important. Very difficult for an organization like ours to kind of parachute in and have the credibility that a local voice could have. But what we do is to provide forums of information, to work to actually bring technical tools to small-scale farmers. We're doing that in the Chesapeake area, we're doing that elsewhere, and by the way, not only ourselves, but teaming up with agricultural extension colleges and so forth. So it's an iterative, step-by-step process, but there are opportunities to engage those small farmers. And you know, most of the farmers around the world want to be good stewards, and sometimes the challenge is just making sure they have the tools and the opportunities and the information to engage.
Next question.
Lindsay Baker, Santa Barbara, California. I understand.
My home.
Yeah, I understand your issues of water management. What if you don't have any water? Southern California drought.
Yeah, so my home is in Santa Barbara, California. I have a creek that runs through my backyard. When I was in Maine the other day, and we were talking about water issues, a speaker had everyone in the room, all from Maine except for me, close their eyes and imagine a water system. And the water system they described was a creek 10 feet wide, water flowing, lush ferns on the side. And I was thinking about the creek through my backyard, an inch wide, dry vegetation. You know, I'm thinking, ooh, they're a little different here. You know, first of all, no single solution. What I will say is a couple of things. One, for municipalities, there are a number of municipalities, and Santa Barbara included, who in the last big drought, which was in the late 80s and early 90s, actually created what was called an inverted block price structure for water, so that you got your, instead of paying less for each increment of water that you used, you got a lifeline amount for the low rate. If you went above that amount to the next tier, you paid 3 times as much, and if you went above that, you paid 10 times as much. It was designed in a way to help low-income folks be secured of having access to basic water needs at an affordable price, but on the other hand, to try and deter really huge water use, such as you know, watering a 3-acre grass lawn type of a thing. Almost overnight, when they implemented that inverted block structure, water use went down about 40%. Now the challenge is that as soon as the drought was called over, they sort of reverted back to the old pricing structure. So I will say one thing, at the municipal level, will have to be mechanisms for better incentivizing conservation, whether it's that particular model or something else, incentivizing conservation. Secondly, gray water is vastly underutilized. I mean, we use drinking water standard water for flushing our toilets. We use drinking water quality for many other uses that are not involved with human consumption.
Yeah, and gray water is?
Gray water is basically treated wastewater. So it's not dirty water. It's water that has gone through the system, been utilized, been treated, but now it's basically then sent out to sea, etc. It can be recycled and reused, for example, for watering lawns, for many other uses, and therefore you're reusing that water rather than simply disposing of it. So there are many municipal tools, but then at the mega level, the state, you know, one of the challenges is until very recently, the state didn't even have any groundwater rules. So you could put rules to do with extracting water from the surface, and then people would say, oh, well, I don't have enough, so I'm just going to go dig a well and take it from the ground. Only recently has the state put that in place. So really complicated. Think about that interconnected complexity. The state needs to think big picture. It is striving sort of to do that, but it has a really long way to go. And all I can say to you is that there's not a single answer. There are many answers, and they have to unfold locally, regionally, and at the state level.
Can I add something here? Yesterday at our discussion at the water table, we met people from Nevada and California who are looking to form an ILO like we have to deal with discussion and education on water issues. And so I guess the letters are going to go to the California leagues to maybe get that started. So that's something to watch for. Individual leagues would then join that and join in education efforts and sharing information and advocating. So, next question?
You know, just making one other comment, given your agenda as an organization and the link between water and climate, I would say the single biggest near-term issue presented by climate change involves water.
Yes.
And the changes that we're seeing in water patterns. So it really becomes a stand up and be counted moment to think about water.
And I would add international security. But I'm Toni Larson. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm on the national board. I have been toying with the idea for about a year now of putting together an interleague organization on the Colorado River. So what I'm doing is collecting names, and I want to start a conversation. I'd like to start a conversation about what the issues are, how we might work together, and so forth. So when this is finished, if you want to come give me your name and want to be part of that conversation, please do.
Thank you very much. The Colorado River, by the way, is one river in the United States that's actually managed by the Department of the Interior, so we were deeply engaged in it. The Secretary of the Interior is the water master for the river. Hugely complicated system. 7 states, a lot of challenges.
Lots of fun, though.
Lots of fun ahead. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for coming. That's the end of the, we're out of time, but can we please thank Lynn for coming out on this Saturday morning? Yeah, thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. Okay.